Verse 11. For if that which is done away was glorious, much more that which remains or is permanent. That's what it means. If that which was done away is glorious, in other words, that glory that was reflected on Moses' face was temporary and it finally faded out and it came to an end. He says much more by comparison, the permanent glory. Glory that's permanent. How much better, how much greater is that? Verse 12. Seeing then that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech. Not as Moses, which put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished. For their minds were blinded. Now Paul takes that veil that was placed over Moses and he makes it an analogy. And he says, just like Moses was veiled, so the minds of those who are under Moses is also veiled. Their minds are veiled. There's a veil over their minds. Their minds are blinded. For until this day remains the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament. Which veil is done away in Christ? He's saying at his time, most of the people that persecuted Paul were Jews, were people under the Old Testament who didn't like what Paul was preaching. And he says they sit there and they read Moses, but there's a blindness on their mind. It's like the veil is still there because if it were ever taken away, they'd see Christ. But they read it and they don't see Christ. Or else if they saw Christ, they wouldn't be persecuting me. They'd be agreeing with me. So he says, when you're in Christ, there's not a veil on your mind. In other words, when we read the Old Testament, the natural thing is to say, oh wow, that's talking about Jesus. How did I ever miss that before? That lamb that they killed at the Passover, that's Jesus. Right? Yeah. All these, I don't want to start going back and mentioning all those again. Over and over again. If I read the Old Testament, all I see, wow, this is Jesus. Hey, there's Jesus again. Here he is again. Jesus. He's everywhere. The veil is done away in Christ. But even unto this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. Nevertheless, when it shall turn to the Lord, or literally when a person, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now, verse 17. The Lord is that Spirit. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Look at verse 18. All of that to get to this. But we all, with open face, that means with an unveiled face, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. Notice he says, we all, with the veil taken away, beholding as in a glass. The word glass there means literally a mirror. Beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are changed into that same image. Now, I know all of you know what a mirror is. Have you ever looked in the mirror? I did this morning. I have to every morning. Because when I go to bed, my hair gets to be a big mess. And I have to look in the mirror to fix it, make it look pretty like this, you see. And so I know all of you do. I know all of you do the same thing. But you see, I've never looked in the mirror and saw anyone other than me. Right? Have you? That would really be disturbing, wouldn't it? Look in the mirror, see somebody else. You only see yourself when you look in the mirror. Is that right? Now, the mirror he's talking about is not the mirror hanging on your wall, but he's talking about really this mirror. And he says, when we behold, as in a mirror, the glory of the Lord, you know what he's saying is, when we, through the revelation of Christ, look at our lives and see the glory of the Lord in our lives, just like what we're talking about this morning. What happens when we can see that? Well, here's what happens. While we look at it, if we'll look at that, if we'll see it that way, we are changed into that same image. The image that we're looking at. From glory to glory. Even as by the Spirit of the Lord. There's an interesting verse that goes along with this. In the next chapter, he continues this same thought. Look down into chapter 4 for a second. Let's see. Verse 6. How about that? For God who commanded the light to this is chapter 4, verse 6. For God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness has shined in our hearts. Do you see that? In our hearts. To give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Now, where is that knowledge? Where has He shined that? In our hearts. He says, just like in the Old Testament, in the beginning, He made a creation out here. The first creation was the external creation, and He said, let there be light, and there was light, right? We've read that. Just like in that first creation, He said, let there be light, and there was light out here. In the new creation, He says, let there be light, and there's light in here. Here's the new creation in here, you see. God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, has shined in our hearts, in your heart, in my heart, to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God. Where is that? In your heart. In the face of Jesus Christ. Next verse. But we have this treasure. What treasure? The light of the knowledge of the glory of God. We have that treasure in earthen vessels. That's this body. That's what we were talking about before. Jesus at the marriage of Cana of Galilee changed what was inside the earthen vessel. He says, we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. In other words, on the outside, we just look ordinary. We just look plain. We look like everybody else. It's just an earthen vessel. But on the inside, He's put a treasure there. He's put a light there. Can I say this? He's put His glory there. Now, go back again to verse 18 of chapter 3. Let's read that again. But we all with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, where? In here, are changed into that same image from glory to glory. In other words, he says, the more you look at it, the more it'll change you. The more you'll look into it, the more you'll give it your attention. See, this is what he said in Colossians chapter 3, when he said, set your mind, set your attention on things above. He didn't mean things up here where the ceiling is. He did things above, higher things, the spiritual things, spiritual, especially who you are in Christ. We all with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord. I think I've told you about this before. John G. Lake, a great man of God, missionary, about 100 years ago, he was a missionary to South Africa. And every morning, I read this in a book about him, every morning he would get up before he would go out to minister. And he would get all dressed in his best clothes, and he would stand before a full-length mirror, and he'd look into the mirror, and he would say, God dwells in that man, before he would ever go out to minister. Why did he do that? For his benefit. Not to tell God something he didn't know. For his benefit, to remind him, to set his perspective of who he saw himself to be before he went out to minister. So he was going to go out and minister to people, not as a man, John G. Lake, just an ordinary man, but as a man in whom the Spirit of God dwells. That's pretty good, isn't it? Now, I'm saying that not just so we can say, wow, John G. Lake was really somebody. You're really somebody. You are really somebody in your life, you see. Now, you're not a missionary to South Africa, but nevertheless, the Spirit of God dwells in you, and He would like to work with you in your life. He would like to work through you and me in our lives. Let me read you this again from the Message. Can you give me verse 18 of the Message, Elliot? All of us. Ooh, that's pretty good right there. All of us. Not just John G. Lake, not just Smith Wigglesworth, not just Billy Graham, and Mother Teresa, not just them. You too. You might think you're just common and ordinary, but that's looking on the outside at the earthen vessel. But he said we've got a treasure in this earthen vessel. And as a matter of fact, he's encouraging us to look at it, to focus our attention on what's on the inside. All of us, nothing between us and God. Our face is shining with the brightness of His face. And so we are transfigured, much like the Messiah. Our lives gradually becoming brighter and more beautiful as God enters our lives and we become like Him. That's pretty good, isn't it? Let's all stand up today. Thank you for being such patient listeners. Jesus is my